and welcome back to another featured thought leader conversation at our 15th annual Global Ethics Summit. I am thrilled to welcome Mary Race, off counsel at Morrison Foerster, based in Palo Alto. Mary, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's going to be a great conversation. Um, In this episode of Ethicast, Mary will share her expert insights on how businesses should handle consumer data based on the requirements of the state regulators, especially in those states with new consumer privacy laws. We'll also speak about the compliance obligations imposed by these new laws, as well as the law's emphasis on transparency, content, and data security. So we have a lot to talk about, Mary.
Yes.
So I'll dive right in. Mary, could you just provide a brief intro into your background and your area of focus?
Sure. So my practice is focused on helping organizations to manage privacy risks and both develop and implement their privacy compliance programs. And I do this across a range of industries from tech and retail to manufacturing and advertising and social media, and work with organizations big and small. And I also help organizations deal with privacy issues that arise when they're rolling out new products or new processes, or when they're negotiating contracts with privacy terms. And recently I've been particularly focused on helping organizations navigate what is becoming a complex and constantly changing world of consumer privacy laws here in the US, including the more well-known California Consumer Privacy Act, and then a number of other state consumer privacy laws. So I'm really glad to be here to talk about all these developments with you today.
Yeah. So to take that further, I'll get right to it, Mary. So we know that over the last year, there's been a rapid uptick in just a number of new state consumer privacy laws, and this year we do anticipate continued legislative and regulatory activity on this front. Could you expand on this further and just let us know a little bit more about your point of view? How do you see this?
Sure. Yeah. It's been a kind of crazy and wild ride, I would say, over the past few years. And like the action shows no signs of slowing
Mhm.
down when it comes to developments on the consumer privacy side in the US. So people may be aware that the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA, it was the first comprehensive consumer privacy law in this country. And it came into effect back in 2020. And then there were recent amendments to it that came into effect last year. But between the advent of the CCPA and now, there have been 16 other states that have enacted their own comprehensive consumer privacy laws, and the number will just keep growing. I think Nebraska's was signed into law just a couple days ago. So it's constantly shifting. And as you mentioned, we've also seen an uptick in enforcement activities by state privacy regulators. So there's a sort of a new sheriff in town, for instance, in California, with the California Privacy Protection Agency, which has made it clear that enforcement is a key part of its mission, and it's assembling a substantial team of enforcement attorneys.
Hmm.
And it's not the only one. The Connecticut Attorney General recently released its first enforcement report under that state's 2023 privacy law. And we can tell that the AGs are focused on, for example, privacy policies, transparency, and how companies respond to consumer requests to protect their data and exercise their privacy rights.
And now to take this closer to our audience, so our chief compliance officers, what should they be keeping in mind as they think about these new consumer privacy laws? If you had to put it into like three top priorities, how would you structure that?
Well, I would say, just to step back for a second, at a high level, I appreciate that this can feel really overwhelming with the number of laws coming online, but I want people to appreciate that there's also good news here, right? And the good news is that despite the large number of these laws, the new state consumer privacy laws have far more commonalities than they do differences. So in my opinion, most organizations can take kind of a single, unified, and practical approach to almost all of their compliance obligations under these laws. And so to try to prioritize, I think some key compliance obligations to keep in mind for these laws are, first of all, remember that these laws are focused on the principle of transparency and about providing appropriate privacy disclosures, such as privacy policies. So this means making sure you're providing consumers with, clear and conspicuous and accurate information about how you collect their data and what you do with it. And we also know regulators, as I mentioned, are really focused on having organizations honor privacy rights requests under these laws. So these laws give consumers a number of rights around their data, like the right to access it, the right to request that an organization delete it, and the right to opt out of certain data practices like targeted advertising or the sale of data. I think a few other points. Remember that your organization may also have to comply with special obligations around sensitive data. And this could include having to get consent to collect that data. For the first time, I think the US privacy laws are focused on protecting sensitive data like race and ethnicity, and children's data is also covered under these laws.
Yeah.
And I'll just cover off with two more points that I want to flag. I know there's a lot here, but these laws do cover a lot of points. But where we've seen also, really regulatory interest and enforcement are around the requirements under these laws to honor the privacy principles of data minimization and proportionality. This is a new stress. We've seen it in the EU for a long time, and now it's here in the US, which basically means the laws say you have to limit your collection and use of data to what's reasonable and what's necessary. So if you tell someone, we're collecting your data to accomplish purposes A and B, then you need to collect only the data that's needed to accomplish purposes A and B. And if you want to do more with that data in ways that aren't compatible with those, your purposes A and B, you may have additional obligations like consent obligations.
Yeah. So speaking on the point of collecting data, what are the important touch points when it comes to collecting and processing personal data under these laws, and what are some of the known risks, and how can organizations focus on risk mitigation? Another loaded question for you, Mary, so feel free to unpack it in any order you feel comfortable unpacking it in.
No, of course. I think it really starts with the basics that important touch points are understanding, first of all, what personal data your organization collects and how it uses that data, right? This sounds simple, but it can turn into, a pretty substantial fact-gathering exercise, particularly because these laws have very broad definitions of personal data. So personal data under these laws is any data that's reasonably linkable to an identifiable individual or to a device in some circumstances. So we're not just talking about name, email address, social security numbers, but personal data can be IP address, online identifiers, device IDs, data collected through cookies or tracking technologies online. So there's a broad universe of data to keep track of. And without a baseline understanding of, what data you're collecting and how you're using it or sharing it, it's really difficult to assess your risk areas. But once you've got that in place, you've understand your data flows and data usage, then you can really focus on risks that will impact your specific organization. And those are going to be different depending on, what you do. But there are some common, I would say, cross-industry risk areas. The privacy regulators are very focused on the collection and use of sensitive data, particularly geolocation data and health data. And they're also focused on targeted advertising and data sales. So those are just areas to look out for across different
Yeah.
countries.
And to build off that point as well, it's just the fact that data resides in so many different parts of an organization. So knowing where the data resides also would help you in gaining that clarity for sure.
Exactly.
Just kind of moving on a bit here, Mary. How can a legal framework for data privacy strike the right balance between the imperatives of privacy protection and striving for innovation and growth?
This is a great question, and I don't think there's one answer. It's just a tricky balance to achieve, and some of the privacy laws we're seeing are more, quote unquote, business friendly than others and provide more flexibility around data use. But overall, I think the clear trend is to limit organizations' use of personal data by giving individual consumers more rights and more choices about their data. And to me, this means companies have to be creative and they have to be proactive in building privacy protection into their products and services. So it's useful to engage early on with your product development teams so you can brainstorm with product and legal and compliance together about building privacy protective features into the product that also allow you to be flexible in how you use data.
That flexibility is certainly key. And you sort of answered that. I haven't the second to last question here. I feel like you kind of touched on it, which is what other functions should compliance rely on for additional support?
Yeah, this is a really important point too. It's critical to have other functions involved so compliance isn't siloed. And so, work with IT and InfoSec teams because they're closely involved with all types of, data collection and storage and security. Engage with your marketing teams, your website and app development teams, because regulators are focused on the use of online tracking technologies and the collection of data online. And I'd flag, remember, don't forget to work with your HR team as well, because the California Consumer Privacy Act is different from the other state laws in that it also covers HR data. So you need to loop them in early on as well to think about how to deal with employee requests under the
Mhm.
CCPA.
Yeah, and just to sort of close the loop on this conversation, Mary, I'd be curious to hear your recommendations. Could you share a little bit more about how companies listening to this conversation, make data privacy just a driving force of their compliance program? And I said driving force with so much emphasis. So,
I know. Well, it's important
yeah.
to everyone, right? Regardless of your industry, regardless of the size of your organization. So I would say what we've already said is know your data, the what, the where, the when, the how, right? Establish that baseline knowledge of what you've got and what you're doing with it. And then educate key stakeholders in the organization at all levels just to raise awareness of how critical privacy is for all companies and help you get buy-in for making privacy central to your compliance program, right? You're going to need resources and support for this. So engage people across the organization so compliance isn't siloed off. And it can feel overwhelming, but try to stay on top of
Yeah.
the privacy developments that can impact your organization. Many law firms, us included, publish alerts highlighting key privacy developments and offer trainings and webinars. And so there are various resources out there, to try to get you the information and support you need.
Yeah, yeah, we really appreciate this, Mary. It was very much helpful, and I know we're right on time. So, with
Okay.
that, Mary, thanks so much for taking the time out just to share so much on this topic and just your patience and, going through each piece of it. Our audience will find that valuable. It certainly is one of those topics that will remain top of mind for our leaders, and just given the nature of these changing and expanded regulations, we will regularly rely on your expertise to help guide us through. But for everyone on the line, you just heard from Mary Race, off counsel at Morrison Foerster. And if you'd like to reach out to Mary directly, she has probably one of the world's most easiest emails to remember. And that's mrace@mofo.com. Mary, thanks so much. It was such a pleasure chatting with you. And I'm looking forward to having you back on Ethicast.
Many thanks. It was a pleasure to join you.
Likewise.
Take care.
Take care.